Alright, welcome back everyone. Let's pick up right where we left off. Vehicles. Now before we get going, I'd like to mention that this guide will probably be my most controversial one, as I have a lot of differing opinions on vehicles from most people. If you're another experienced community member and you want to discuss something in the comments, the only thing I ask is that you please watch the entire guide all the way through, since I'm going to be revisiting a lot of topics, and I'm going to be discussing a lot of things that then I will kind of contradict later on, using them as examples of previous versions of the game. Now, if I were just to explain the current vehicle meta to you, this guide would be outdated within a single patch. Instead, I'm going to walk you through a brief history of vehicles in Squad and how I learned to use them over the course of several updates. Rather than explaining the advantages and disadvantages of vehicles straight away, hopefully I'll teach you how to draw those conclusions yourself. To start, let's take it all back to V9. Back then, APCs were the top dogs. There were no IFVs or tanks. The strongest vehicle in the game was the BTR-82. There was no component damage, and the armor values were the same everywhere on the vehicle. Penetration was a simple yes or no, depending on weapon caliber, and every vehicle only had one ammo type. There was also no stabilization or smoke screens, and LATs carried two rockets and didn't have to worry about persistent ammo. The crewman role didn't even exist, so any infantryman could man one. So let's take a look at how the striker performed within the context of a squad back then. When you're looking at any type of armored vehicle in really any scenario, whether you're comparing it against a squad without one or another vehicle, the three key factors to be considering are firepower, protection, and mobility. The striker's 50 cal was capable of penetrating every single vehicle in the game and would generally one-shot infantry. It also had great velocity, rate of fire, and it had great optics, so it was practical at almost any range. Having a striker in your squad could prove to significantly increase your firepower. The armor on the striker was enough to survive 4 shots from any LAT. I can't remember off the top of my head how many hats it could take, but I'm fairly sure that one would take it to around 25% health. Let's also not forget that there was no component damage back then. So if you took a rocket, you knew exactly how much damage it's going to do, and you still know exactly how much health you'll have left. You'll also still be entirely functional. You're not going to be losing tires or engines. This allows for the striker to be able to safely bail after taking a rocket or two without having to worry about being immobilized. There's also definitely something to be said about having a vehicle that's entirely immune to small arms, meaning that 7 out of the 9 players in your average enemy squad are just incapable of doing anything about you. As for the mobility, strikers would get around at about the same speed as a transport or logi truck. They could also carry your entire squad. Don't forget that this is back when logistic trucks only carried 4 people, so your basic loadout if you were just rolling out with trucks was going to be a transport and a logi. So, just to review, if you had a striker in your squad, you had a weapon system with more damage, range, and anti-vehicle capability than any of your squad's rifles. You had a chassis that was immune to small arms and could survive serious punishment from AT reliably, keeping your entire squad safe all while you're being transported across the map. And it had the same speed as the standard trucks, with a higher carrying capacity than logis. And yet, I very quickly learned never to use them within my infantry squads. Why? There are several reasons, and I'll go through all of them, but I want to start with the one that was most relevant to V9. Back then, strikers were worth 24 tickets. That's right, you're hearing that correctly. One striker was worth more than 2 full infantry squads. A squad with a striker was worth 33 tickets. Over 3 times as much as a standard infantry squad. Bear in mind, we've only talked about the striker here. The BTR-82 was worth 28 tickets alone. Back in V9, when I was first starting to experiment with armor, I was trying all sorts of different things. I was running mechanized infantry, I was running my own dedicated APC squads, or I was just commanding APCs within somebody else's squad. I was growing more and more experienced and learning how the core principles of combined arms warfare applied to squad. Now, in real life, there are big challenges when it comes to taking vehicles into urban or just close range combat, but they can often be overcome with a variety of things, such as infantry support, extra armor packages, overwhelming firepower, But these don't really apply in squad because I didn't have stabilization or thermals or ERA, and even when you play effectively with an infantry net around you, there's a lack of fear of death, and that makes it incredibly easy for AT to sneak up on you and get their rocket off. Through all of the patches in squad, a dedicated AT player will go to great lengths to land a rocket on you, regardless of the consequences after he fires that rocket. Even with infantry protection, it's pretty damn easy to land a rocket on an APC in an urban or forested environment if you don't fear for your life. So when I was doing some combined arms warfare with my squad, these challenges led to taking a lot of hits. But as I said before, the striker, or BTR, could take a reliable amount of punishment and still retreat effectively. Using these strategies, I very rarely lost vehicles, but ultimately I wasn't able to hang around and protect infantry for any significant amount of time. My gunner would usually get a handful of kills, but due to the amount of time spent out of the action when I was eventually hit and had to RTB, it wasn't enough to make up for the vehicle's cost if we lost it, which did happen on occasion. Ultimately, we were being generally effective, but rarely effective enough to justify the risk or the two men taken out of the infantry squad to man the vehicle, constantly returning to base and not being a part of the action. Once again, I want to call back to the fact that LAT didn't have to worry about persistent ammo, so even if one of these guys was taken down by our infantry net before he could get a shot on us while we were busy being claustrophobic in our vehicle in a city, that person's just going to respawn with all of the information they've already gathered and try a new approach immediately with two fresh rockets. And so, with what I learned, I tried out a different strategy, avoiding AT by remaining out of their range, attempting to support my squad, or random squads if I'm running dedicated armor, at longer ranges outside of the effective fire of infantry and lats, from elevated positions with good sightlines in the objectives. Now, the advantages of this are immediately apparent. In a good location with decent sightlines, you can absolutely massacre infantry while they're nearly helpless to react. You're significantly safer from most AT threats, and you spend a lot more time in the action because of that. You're way less likely to be returning to base constantly for repairs, which allows you to contribute more towards the squads actually trying to capture that objective. Now, AT will still be quite dedicated, and they will hike to your location and hit you with a rocket or two if you stay there long enough. It's just something that's going to happen in squad, and that will force you to return to base, but that can also be avoided by occasionally relocating if the map permitted it and you had several angles to shoot into an objective. There were, however, two massive downsides to this strategy. The first is that it's not always a viable option. Obviously, not all objectives in Squad are little compounds surrounded by hills. Not everything allows for these kind of engagements. Mestia, Kohat, Logar Valley, these are good maps with hilly terrain that allow you to shoot into compounds, but flatter maps are going to make it incredibly difficult to actually pull this off. The other big downside has to do with vehicle-on-vehicle engagements. See, we haven't talked about this yet, but if you're doing the first approach where you're working in combined arms with infantry, you have a certain set of advantages against enemy vehicles. If they are mirroring your approach and they're also working close with their infantry in a combined arms setting and you're fighting each other on an objective, it's a bit of a 50-50. You both have infantry nets, you're probably going to see each other at about the same time or have their locations communicated to each other at the same time by the infantry, and then you're probably going to get into a bit of a head-to-head coin toss. Anyone could come out on top. And if you have an enemy vehicle on a hill with sightlines into you, you also have sightlines onto them. Generally speaking, they're going to get the first few shots off and have a better chance of killing you, but then you have a chance to pull into cover or to find him and engage him back, and you still have a chance of pulling it off if you do well. Now, while we were on the hilltops, there would be situations where we'd see vehicles down below in the objectives knife fighting with infantry. Those vehicles would generally be fairly easy kills, especially if they were being one-manned or manned by incompetent vehicle players, as many were back in V9. However, we were also easy prey for other vehicles loitering outside of objectives, who could hear us firing on infantry and flank us, destroying us before we knew what had happened. Now, if you're sitting on a hill firing into infantry, you can bet your bottom dollar that infantry has marked you on the map, and now any vehicle who's outside the AO is going to be able to get line of sight on you very easily. You're on top of a hill to get good line of sight on the objective, and that works both ways. That means there's a lot of areas on the map that have good line of sight on you. And while you're tunnel visioned in on there, you are totally exposed without any sort of defense. for any vehicle smart enough to flank you. Now, when I was using this strategy of sitting on the hills, I began to notice a trend. I would start keeping track of how many tickets I was gaining or losing for my team. On games where the enemy played their vehicles like shit, constantly dive bombing them into objectives without support, I was having incredible matches where I destroy an incredible amount of enemy vehicles and gain a massive amount of tickets for my team. On games where the enemy armor promptly located, stalked, and then destroyed us, I would lose unacceptable amounts of tickets over the course of a match. I soon began to realize that the ticket difference from destroying vehicles or being destroyed myself was drastically outweighing the ticket difference from the amount of infantry we were killing in any of these scenarios. As I said in the first part of the intermediate guide, the vehicle play in squad does have an impact on the match as a whole. How well your armor is doing can make or break matches in which not a lot of objectives are moving. But back in V9, every match was being played by two independent groups of people, the infantry and the armor. Armor losses could count for over 100 tickets in a fairly average match and oftentimes went well beyond that. With this realization, I started to notice that using APCs in a conventional role and supporting friendly infantry was definitely possible, especially with a solid understanding of how combined arms works, but ultimately it had a fairly limited effect on the match. Theoretically, you could make the difference that would allow for your infantry to capture a flag, but it was certainly a challenge, and it came with the cost of having to be constantly firing, giving away your location, and not paying attention to your surroundings or the vehicle play around the map, which in turn meant that you were gambling with massive amounts of tickets if the enemy had their act together. I started playing APCs specifically as a counter to enemy vehicles. Whether it was logistics, parked trucks, or APCs, my strategy started to revolve purely around the destruction of enemy assets. For example, when Narva was first released, the Russians had two BTR-82s. Now, I used to run a four-man squad dedicated to those vehicles. We would circle all around Narva, keeping both BTRs close together and using what I had mentioned in the previous guide about the blueberry effect to stay well clear of infantry. Even if we did have to go near infantry, we would constantly be tearing down those roads at full speed, and by the time they managed to pull out their disposable launchers, we'd usually be beyond their line of sight. I would announce to our team while I was doing this that if they marked any vehicles, I would be there to destroy them immediately. We never stopped moving, regularly circling back into the enemy's territory to try to stumble across logistics or vehicles moving to and from their main base. Any time an enemy vehicle was marked, I used the expansive road network and the great mobility of the 30 mil, as well as my map knowledge, to flank it and destroy it. It was incredibly easy to do incredibly quickly if the intel we had was solid. They never stood a chance. One minute they'd be supporting their infantry, and the next they heard the terrifying chunk, chunk, chunk of the old 30 mil reduced rate of fire tearing their vehicle apart from behind. Now, using these tactics, we negated the fatal flaw of the APCs, which was their 28 ticket cost, by never loitering around AT and never engaging vehicles that we didn't have a complete intel advantage over. Even if we took a stray rocket somehow, because of the fact that we never stopped moving, they would never get a second shot off, and it was incredibly easy to return to base and repair. Remember, no component damage or localized armor values meant that we always took the same amount of damage and were never immobilized. In the same way that we negated our vehicle's ticket costs by never putting them in any real dangerous situations, we capitalized on the mistakes of the enemies doing exactly that. Time and time again, a vehicle marker would appear on the map, I'd hear some chatter on command chat, and a 50 cal in the distance, and most often within a minute we'd be there pounding that vehicle into the ground. I used to call it the 90-second BHM guarantee. You mark it, we'll destroy it within a minute and a half. Even when the vehicles weren't spotted, we would be constantly harassing their logistics network, running into and destroying countless transports, logistics, and APCs moving to and from their base. Some squad matches will stick in your memory long after they've ended. During one of these Narva matches, where I ran a 4-man 30 mil squad, we did incredibly well. The enemy was refusing to learn, communicate, or change their tactics, and we ended up killing 6 strikers, which was worth 144 tickets, and then beyond that we killed a greater number of MRAPs and trucks combined. Back then, MRAPs were worth 12 or 14 tickets, and most of the trucks were worth 8, I believe. All things totaled, we gained well over 200 tickets for our team, while losing absolutely none. and bear in mind that's a pretty modest estimate. Our infantry didn't do so hot that match. They were steadily pushed back, controlling a minority of the flags for a majority of the game, back when ticket bleed was still in and pretty punishing. At one point, they were pushed back to defending our mercy bleed point, only managing to recover one flag before the match ended. We barely won. I can't remember the exact number of tickets we had left, but it was less than 20. During the entire match, the squad leads on our team were yelling at me. I spent 90% of my team far from active objectives, and even when I stopped by, it was only for long enough to destroy a vehicle and take off again. In the end screen, both of my gunners had fewer than 10 kills. The crew of almost every vehicle we killed had entirely bailed before it was destroyed, and we weren't exactly sticking around to clean up infantry. When the end screen came up, the most vocal squad leader started bashing us, and everyone else quickly hopped in on the bandwagon, complaining about our lack of kills and the fact that they never saw us on an objective. And yet, if we weren't there, we would have lost that game by 200 tickets. APC stands for Armored Personnel Carrier. The standard doctrine in most conventional armies states that the role of the APC is to transport an infantry squad around and provide them with fire support. In real life, APCs are designed entirely for combined arms warfare. But this is squad, not real life, and the way it plays out is very, very different. And if you continue to stubbornly stick by real world doctrine, you're going to have some situations where you are less effective in the game because of it. Now, let's say I was stubborn and insisted to sit by real world doctrine here. If I had given the infantry support directly on the objectives, would it have given them an advantage? Yes. However, I never would have stayed past taking a single rocket. BTRs took 3 lats to kill back then, and if I was lost, we were down 28 tickets. Every single time I was hit with LAT, we would have been returning to base to repair to prevent that from potentially happening. Let's not forget that back in V9, the cannon also only had AP shells, so you had to score direct impacts on infantry, with an artificially reduced rate of fire. The main cannon was only marginally more effective than rifle fire would have been when it came to engaging soft targets. But that being said, we still probably would have given the infantry a marginal improvement in effectiveness. Possibly, though doubtfully, enough to make a difference on maybe one of those flag captures. In return, we would have been constantly gambling our combined value between both vehicles of 54 tickets, returning to base way more frequently, and only engaging enemy vehicles on even terms with both of us aware of each other's presence. Even more of a chance of losing a vehicle. Also, let's say the enemy team was a little bit smarter, they could have been doing exactly what we were doing to them. The moment I pulled up with that infantry, I could have been hearing a 50 cal hitting my ass and I could have been dead in seconds. But let's not forget about transporting infantry, which is the main function of the APC. I've only talked about supporting them. Now, when it comes to transporting infantry, I absolutely would have done that. We were lightning fast across that map, and if somebody had asked, I would have been there in seconds to pick them up and move them to the next objective. And that still is a really good function of APCs. APCs are very good at getting an infantry squad from point A to point B relatively unharmed. The thing about it is there's a very funny habit of people in squads simultaneously complaining that APC squads never transport infantry and also never asking APC squads to transport their infantry. Now, in V9, I didn't try to offer transportation any more than letting everyone know that it was an option available to them during the staging phase. Or I guess this was prior to the staging phase, so during the early opening end of the match. Now, there's another cool thing that you can do with APCs, and that is acting as, I don't want to say a commander, but acting as the entire team's mobility. Basically, everything that I preached in the last guide, if you watched it, about the importance of moving lightning fast between objectives, keeping momentum going, and constantly staying relevant, is not common knowledge. It seems like it's common knowledge, but it really, really, really isn't. Once you actually get into live games and start playing, you're going to find that you're the only squad actually participating in the lightning fast squad meta. Now, if you are running an APC, especially in current versions where you're no longer the top dog and the one who can really take on any armor, it's very interesting to play a sort of, commander role about things and start getting ready to mobilize people as objectives become irrelevant and then acting as their sense of urgency, talking to them in command chat and trying to really instill that sense of fear, that need to get onto the next objective and try to rush them along. I've actually had some success working this tactic, and it's a fun way of playing both vehicles and infantry simultaneously, which are normally quite independent of one another. But back in V9, I didn't do this because the APCs had such valuable anti-armor capability. By the time I suggested that somebody needed to move, because I saw them in an outdated objective, and then they processed that and talked to their squad, decided to do it, dragged everybody off, disengaged from the firefight, and clumped them up. Now, that's a very hard thing for even experienced SLs to do in a timely manner, and chances are if these guys are lagging behind because they're not aware of the objective changes, that it's not an experienced SL. It took a lot of time to do this, and that was a lot of time where I was not hunting enemy vehicles, getting massive ticket gains for our team. As I said, APCs were incredibly effective against vehicles if you played them correctly, since the enemy players rarely would. Even if our average match didn't gain the team 200 tickets and save them from defeat, it was still worth the time for us to use our vehicles to hunt the enemy and punish their carelessness. We would still gain 60 to 120 tickets on the average match, depending on how long it lasted and whether or not we lost any vehicles ourselves. Not to mention the fact that we'd be keeping our friendly infantry free from having to deal with enemy armor, and crippling supply lines and potentially even destroying squads trying to relocate and build new fobs on new objectives and logi trucks. So why am I telling you all of this? V9 is the past, almost none of this is applicable anymore, and vehicle balance is in an entirely different place now than it was back then. I'm telling you this because it is the perfect example of the way you need to be looking at vehicles, objectively. List them by their attributes, their advantages and their disadvantages, and then find the role that they have in squad. Watch what they're doing, see the way that they're helping the team or hindering the team using your knowledge of the game. Like I've said so many times before, the people who quote the field manuals of various armed forces trying to legitimize their arguments for their strategies need to understand that squad is nothing like real combat. In the real world, various armed forces design vehicles to protect infantry. In the real world, I am sure that the US Army would gladly lose an MRAP if it saved the lives of 5 men. In V9 Squad, it was significantly cheaper to lose 5 men than it was to lose an MRAP. People who attempted to commit to real-world doctrine hurt their team because of this. In this situation, I recognized the extreme harm of losing APCs. The ticket values were just absurd, easily negating squad wipes and flag captures. Because of this, I adopted a playstyle with the vehicles that drastically decreased the likelihood of them being lost. The same strategy capitalized on the carelessness of the enemy team with expensive assets, focusing on destroying enemy APCs putting themselves in vulnerable states in order to attempt a combined arms strategy, which wouldn't ultimately work. It also negated the human error aspect by allowing myself to be in almost absolute control. I would pick the routes, I would lead the pack, and I made the decisions on what to or not to engage. The driver behind me only had to follow me, and the gunners only had to keep their eyes forward and hold down the trigger when applicable. I will move on to discuss vehicle balance today, but as I said before, that section of the guide will age terribly, and learning to analyze the vehicle meta of your current patch objectively is a valuable skill. Anyway, let's move on to V10. Ultimately, it didn't change way too much. It gave the 30mm HE rounds, it added a coax MG, it removed the artificial rate of fire nerf, and then it added smoke grenade launchers to both the 30mm and the striker. These changes ultimately made both APCs more effective at fighting infantry and increased their effectiveness in combined arms, but still not nearly enough to make up for the massive downsides. V11, on the other hand, was an absolutely massive change to vehicle balance. ATGMs, IFVs, an entirely new damage model, and changes to lats completely shifted everything. APCs were made into absolute jokes, only taking a single lat to the rear to destroy. Warriors and Bradleys overpowered all of Russia's armor, completely immune to 30mm frontally, and with a faster time to kill to a BTR's front armor than a BTR had to their rear armor. ATGMs gave infantry an incredibly powerful anti-tank weapon, far more powerful than handheld AT and capable of one-shotting any piece of armor at incredible ranges. It removed the long-range dominance of vehicles and handed it right back to the infantry. V11 was absolutely hilarious to behold. If you played a match on Kohat Every single hilltop would be littered with vehicle carcasses. On every other map, Lat would casually dispatch of APCs and IFVs that made the mistake of wandering within 200 meters of objectives. When vehicles met outside of objectives, brainless BTR-82 drivers would sit and fire at the front armor of Bradleys and Warriors, scratching their heads as to how they possibly lost the engagements. Ticket values were initially absurd, with Bradley's being worth 37 tickets, but the devs quickly reduced them when they saw the graveyards on the top of hills. After the change, IFVs like the Bradley and Warrior were worth 25 tickets, and then APCs were dropped to 20. Although the V9 tactics were still marginally effective in V11, the likelihood of losing vehicles was significantly increased. Even the old, safe, long-range engagements were made perilous by tows. Not only did you need to steer clear of infantry like before, but you also needed to predict, spot, and avoid tow sightlines. On maps like Kohat, I would still run my 4-man BTR squads, but ultimately it became more of a fun and extremely difficult challenge than an actual effective strategy. It could maybe award you with a couple of IFV kills over 60 minutes of gameplay. If you wanted an actual effective strategy for destroying vehicles with the same number of men, creating tow fobs was the way to go. Eventually, even on public servers, people started leaving all heavy armor in main due to the absolute uselessness of it in V11. That's saying quite a lot. Obviously, the competitive players were doing that from the start, but the fact that even public servers were willing to coordinate leaving armor at main should show you just how much of a shit show that was. Avoiding tows became a full-time job, causing us to have to take incredibly wide flanks, memorize elevated positions, peek every hill we wanted to crest on foot prior to driving up, and then constantly scan the hilltops for deadly clusters of pixels over a kilometer away. It usually meant an ATGM was inbound. Now I'd like to talk about a match that I had at Kohat during this V11 stage, where I was playing as an infantry squad, and a squad leader that I did not get along with, we were constantly fighting, he decided to run 3 warriors. This was shortly after the release of V11, and they were a hot new thing, and the British layer had them, so he went for them. And I'm all for that. Running dedicated armor squads is something that I strongly advocate for, which you'll find out later. Anyway, as he's rolling them along Kohat, he decides to take them onto this south hill here. And if you know anything about the layout of this map, then you understand that that is visible from the majority of the hills on the map. As he was driving along that road, I warned him that the enemy team was almost definitely going to set up a tow fob, or possibly even 2, and that he needed to be careful with that. He ignored me, and he continued to go along the road, and sure as shit, an ATGM slammed into his front vehicle and insta-killed it. Now, the second vehicle and the third vehicle started stopping and trying to locate it. The second ATGM was already in the air by then, took out the second vehicle, and the third one just turned and booked it, but he was too late. The third ATGM slammed into the rear, and over the course of just a couple of minutes, our team lost 75 tickets. Now, when V11 first came out and added these IFVs and these ATGMs, I took a look at them when the playtests were live and I did some testing, and I saw that these ATGMs would one-shot vehicles, that they had incredible range, and I saw that the BTR-82 couldn't damage the front of these IFVs, and I factored this into what I knew about the current meta in V10, and I came to the conclusion that things were going to be very different in V11, and I adopted a new playstyle because of it. My first thought was obviously I can't crest the high ground without information about the surrounding map, under the assumption that there could be a tow anywhere that could immediately take me out. I also knew that if I was running BTR-82s, I couldn't go anywhere near infantry because even a stray rocket could one-shot me from the rear. I also took into consideration that if I was running BTR-82s, I would have to get side or rear shots on IFVs in order to actually take them down. So using this strategy, I adopted a bit of a low ground, high ground, concealment to positioning kind of strategy, where I would go around the outskirts of the map, I would wait for intel on enemy IFVs, and then I would find the best possible hill for me to engage it, drive there using the low ground where I was never going to have line of sight with a tow, get onto that hill on foot first and scout out for potential tow positions, and then get my vehicles to engage the IFV or the tow or whatever it is I need to kill, and then scoot the fuck out of there before the IFVs adjusted and came at me from a new angle where I would not be able to damage them. Now, this was incredibly inefficient. It obviously took a very, very long time to pull these flanks off on Kohat, and like I was saying, my strategies became more of a for fun thing than a super effective thing. But I would still argue that what I was doing was the most effective use of those vehicles when they were that underpowered in that patch. They just weren't going to help the team a lot no matter how you ran them. And of course, what I was doing was a lot better than immediately losing 75 tickets by taking IFEs and then losing them because I was using outdated tactics. Now, I'm not saying that my initial reactions were perfect and that I completely understood the new meta before it was developed. There's a lot of things I learned and a lot of mistakes I made while adopting these tactics. In particular, I wasn't aware of how underpowered the 30 mils cannon would be. I assumed that it would do some pretty good damage to the side of these IFEs, whereas in reality I would have to keep both cannons together, fire at the same time, and hope that I could get enough sustained fire before the IFE turned, since they were basically marshmallow shooters. I was also much more limited in the range that I could engage them because of the damage drop-off that I hadn't really considered. But what I did, like I said, was better than just using the outdated information and driving into a hilariously predictable ambush. This is another example of looking at the current patch, looking at the way things are changing, and then making decisions based on that. Now, a couple of other things to note are that, first off, that guy wasn't the lone offender. Obviously, I had some disagreements with him in the past, but that's not why I'm singling him out. It's just because I remembered that story because of it. Everybody was running armor this way. Nobody was taking ATGMs into consideration. They were all just running by their Combined Arms Warfare book and then complaining that ATGMs were overpowered. And because of this, ATGMs got nerfed quite heavily. They were very realistic with their introduction, and now they have artificial range limits and they don't one-shot a lot of vehicles. Now, this kind of disappoints me as a squad player, that a fairly realistic and challenging thing was added to the game, and that people refused to adapt to it, and because of it, it got taken out of the game to some extent. Now, I'm not necessarily making the argument that ATGMs didn't need a nerf. I personally would have liked for them to stay realistic, but I can understand the gameplay decision to take them down a bit. But you guys have to admit that recently, with a few patches that Squad has pushed out, there has been some questionable content and some interesting direction that the game is taking, where a lot of people are feeling that it's going much more casual than it should be. And I would just like to use this guide and this platform as a means to say you should always try to adapt to a new challenge before you complain that it's too challenging. Back in V11, I honestly felt like I was one of the only people running vehicles who was actively trying to adapt to new threats rather than just complaining about the fact they were there and doing the same old thing with shitty results. Anyway, let's move on to V12. V12 seemed to be where Squad really got its identity for how vehicle and infantry should interact. There have been small changes since V12, but for the most part, that got the fundamentals down. Now, the introduction of tanks was obviously massive, but that wasn't really all of it. APCs and IFEs were also put into a better situation than they had ever been previously. These days, the exact number of rockets or shells required to kill any vehicle is more varied than ever, with ammo racks and the ability to get mobility kills. Even with all of the new modules that could be damaged, vehicles were still way more survivable than they were in V11. They were still not as survivable as they were in V9, where you could just take a few rockets and return to base with no negative consequences. Of course, the possibility for the mobility kill is there. But what really truly makes up for this was the fact that the ticket costs were finally reduced. Now, this is the current value as well, where trucks are worth 5 tickets, APCs and IFEs are worth 10 tickets, and then tanks are worth 15 tickets. This is huge, especially when you combine it with the fact that ammo plays a significantly bigger role in V12 and later patches than it did in any other patch. APCs and IFEs can carry a pretty significant supply around to help your infantry. Let's not forget that they also got stabilization, which assists them in combined arms warfare. The vehicle will still double the ticket cost of your squad, but now you can start to see reward outweigh the risk. In V9, I would have laughed if somebody said to me that a 9-man squad with a striker was effective enough to be worth 33 tickets. In the current version of the game, if somebody made the argument that a 9-man squad with a BTR-82 or a Bradley was effective enough to be worth 19 tickets, I would definitely see their point. V12 through V15, and I'm guessing later patches, I'll clarify in the comments if there's corrections, are the only patches that I've played where I consider true combined arms warfare to be a viable strategy. Not using an APC as a battering ram to deliver a 9-man squad straight to the enemy, limping off while smoking, not using it to fly into a FOD, place into the open and proxy it or destroy the radio, but actually using it in conjunction with infantry for an extended period of time to increase their effectiveness. It can sustain some damage and now carries ammo for the squad, which is significantly more important than it used to be, and if it's lost, your team isn't bankrupt. But I still don't use them with my 9-man squads, and I don't think you should either. So why not? There are four main reasons. First of all, approving armored vehicles once again comes down to idealism versus realism. You need to be realistic with your expectations for the vehicle crew. I've noticed an improvement in the community's skill level with vehicles ever since tanks were released, but it's still far from perfect. In a V9, it was hilariously bad. Every day you'd see some medic one-man a BTR-82 drive it straight into the attack objective and get blown up in seconds. Today, it's more manageable, but you can still see people doing absolutely ridiculous shit with them, thinking it's Battlefield 4 and they can knife fight with infantry alone and come out on top. If I'm squad leading, I don't want to babysit and micromanage an APC or IFV. I need to allow them some freedoms, or my concentration is going to be too split to effectively lead my squad. Oftentimes, this means I'm choosing between keeping my situational awareness up to make sure I'm leading effectively while allowing the vehicle crew to make poor decisions, or explaining how I want the vehicle to be run while ignoring my other responsibilities. APCs and IFVs are still only powerful if used correctly, and a big chunk of the community doesn't know how to use them effectively. Everything I've said so far has been under the assumption that it's being run competently. That's just not always the case, though. Even though ticket costs aren't at V9 levels, it is still a blow to lose an armored vehicle, and I don't want to be held responsible for that if the people that I've chosen to hand the asset to play poorly. Another thing to mention is that I have seen way more dedicated AT players than dedicated vehicle players. I am regularly blown away with some of the stuff that I see some people doing, where they've memorized everything to do with the lat kit, the hat kit, and all of the armor values of every enemy vehicle, and are capable of pulling off some incredible shit with it. On the flip side, I rarely find even basically competent vehicle players, and it's incredibly rare to find people who actually dedicate themselves to vehicles and actively try to get better with them. Now, fortunately for me, I have a clan. I can assign somebody I trust to the driver's seat of the vehicle and rest assured knowing that they'll play the vehicle effectively, so I don't have to worry about it. This point is almost entirely negated for me, but if you're leading random blueberry squads, it's something that you need to very strongly consider. Second, combined arms is still ineffective in a large number of scenarios. In many situations, a vehicle can be detrimental to your success. If you're fighting from hilltop to hilltop, that vehicle is going to perform really well and help you out, but vehicles are a liability in urban and densely forested environments. One minute, you might be enjoying the increased fire support of your vehicle, and then the next minute, you'll be bending over backwards to protect it and wishing you didn't have to worry about it at all. Don't forget that the nature of combat in squad tends to reward condensing as much infantry as possible into very small zones. Just about everything that you're hoping to accomplish with your squad will ultimately come down to staying alive in very confined areas, whether it's moving a cap zone or proxying an enemy fob. If you're securing a compound, that vehicle may be useful up until you breach that wall, but afterwards you're just at a two-man disadvantage. Vehicles are also incredibly conspicuous. I'll talk more about my strategy for attacking flags in the advanced guides, but it's very heavily dependent on stealth. This means I need to be keeping my vehicle away during my initial push, only bringing it in after I've been detected. That sounds relatively easy, but once you start approaching situations like this and trying to coordinate it, it can be surprisingly difficult. You're already right there, right on the enemy objective, trying your best to make sure that everyone in your squad's holding fire and stressing about that, and sometimes the last thing you need is a vehicle to worry about as well, especially if you have a less than ideal vehicle crew. Now, this argument about how situational vehicles are is one of the biggest ones for why I don't take them. I would much rather have a 9-man infantry squad and a 2-man dedicated vehicle squad. If I'm at an objective in which vehicle support would be handy, hopefully the vehicle crew is aware of that and will support me. If I'm sneaking off to attack a densely forested objective, I do not want a great lumbering beast behind me, attracting unwanted attention. Hopefully, in that situation, the vehicle crew will go somewhere that suits their strengths more. You can make the argument that it's still a possibility for the vehicle to break off and do something else while you're in a situation where it's not useful. That's totally true, but when it happens, what am I? I'm just a regular infantry squad that's down 2 men. And what are they? They're just a random vehicle in the middle of nowhere with no access to command chat. It would be much, much more efficient and effective if they were their own squad with access to command chat that wasn't stealing 2 of my slots for infantry. More of that with point 4. Now, the third reason is a massive one as well, mobility. Now, real quick, let's assume that I'm taking this vehicle as my main means of transportation, right? I will discuss taking vehicles in addition to your main means of transportation later on in point 4, but for now, let's assume that the reason you're getting the vehicle is for the mobility of it, because you're at main and you need to get to the objective and you're trying to decide the most appropriate resource for you to do that. Now, anything with tracks is too slow and is immediately not considered. It's only going to slow my squad down, and the extra armor and the extra firepower is completely worthless if I can't use my standard strategies of just absolutely keeping the enemy team reeling and on their toes. I would much, much, much rather have a completely unprotected truck than a slow tracked vehicle. Now, even if we're taking a wheeled APC instead of a slow tracked vehicle, trucks are still more reliable methods of transportation. The reason for this is, let's say I'm defending a flag and my APC gets hit by a rocket. I'm telling him to return to base in order to avoid losing tickets when he dies. Depending on where I'm at on the map, that could take a significant amount of time. If the flags shift while the vehicle is away, I don't have a ride to the next point. When it comes to trucks, they are rarely engaged or destroyed unless your squad is already wiped. If you park outside the defense objective and walk inside, enemies that see your vehicle usually won't have a reason to engage it. They'll ignore it and push in. If you park it outside of the attack objective and walk in, the enemy will be far more focused on fighting your squad than destroying the vehicle that you guys came in. If you're wiped, your ability to relocate doesn't matter as you now have the entire map available to spawn at. If you win, you wipe the enemies and your truck was never touched. In all of these situations, an APC would have been engaged by LAT or enemy armor, likely meaning that it would have needed repairs and would have been unable to transport you for a significant amount of time while it returned to base. That can leave you in a situation where you are alive and unable to relocate as the objectives shift, which I consider to be just an unacceptable scenario. Similarly, if you're attacking an objective in an urban area and you decide to send your vehicle somewhere else where it'll be effective, you're out of a ride. Don't forget that that's going to be a massive number of situations where your ride is going to be ineffective where you're at. You're either putting a valuable team asset at a disadvantage by keeping it with you when it puts it in danger, or you're putting your squad at a disadvantage by limiting your ability to mobilize in order to protect your main method of transportation and send it somewhere where it's more effective as a fighting vehicle. Of course, this doesn't apply if you have a second vehicle, as I already mentioned, and I will be touching up on that with point 4. I would so much rather be in charge of a truck and park it at an objective and understand that it's there and I can get back to it. Even if your APC is doing well and is capable of transporting you because it's in tip-top condition and they're effective at fighting, even in close quarters combat, having your main means of transportation be crewed by 2 people who are focused on how they can effectively use it in combat can be an absolute nightmare. Think back to the many, many times in this guide that I've stressed the importance of disengaging and relocating away from irrelevant firefights, and how many times I've explained how incredibly difficult it can be when you're dealing with blueberries. Now imagine that you don't just have to wrestle infantry into a truck that you have ready, but first you have to wrestle an armored vehicle away from a fight to actually be the means of transportation for everyone else to get into. Once again, given that I have an experienced clan, I don't have to worry as much about that last point, but if you're leading blueberries, you absolutely need to worry about it. Now you could make the argument that everything I said in point 3 is completely irrelevant if you take 2 vehicles, an APC or IFV and then a truck of some sort. But that brings me to the fourth and final reason, which is just, what's the point? The reason why I'm grabbing a vehicle at main is for mobility. Now, an APC is also very mobile, and in addition, it has firepower and protection, which is why I might consider it in place of a truck. However, I'm never going to be considering a Bradley because it's slow and because it's lowering my mobility. Now, if I'm grabbing a truck, I already have mobility covered. The other thing I'm grabbing is literally just there for the firepower and the armor. And that firepower and armor is going to be very, very useful on the battlefield in certain areas. The goals of armor and the goals of infantry do not align very often. It's very rare that a Bradley and an infantry squad are going to need to be in the exact same spot in order for them both to increase the effectiveness of the team as much as each of them possibly can. That Bradley should be denying the enemy team assets, destroying enemy armor, destroying enemy logistics, and potentially destroying enemy fobs and infantry from a safe distance where they're not going to get surrounded and immobilized. If they need to get in close, then it is possible that combined arms will be the best strategy for them, but that's only going to be in flags where they can kind of pull that off, not densely populated urban ones, which is often exactly where the infantry needs to be in order to have the most concealment and cover to push into the objective. Now, if the infantry is in an open objective, and there's something in that objective that cannot be approached from any other angle, and the Bradley needs to go in, then yes, your goals align. You both need to be exactly there. But how often is that going to be the case? What is the actual point of having both of those units in the exact same squad, where you're either making the Bradley less effective or making the infantry less effective? The ideal thing to do here is obviously to have a dedicated 2-man IFE squad doing their thing, and then to have a dedicated 9-man infantry squad doing their thing that can then work together when their goals align. I simply do not want to babysit something that's only going to come in handy at certain fairly specific situations and is most likely going to be better used somewhere else. Now, I have to admit that in some ways I'm actually being an idealist rather than a realist here, despite how many times I preach not doing exactly that in my guides. Just because I'm not approving the vehicle from my squad doesn't mean that somebody competent is going to take it and use it in the way that I've laid out. I have seen the argument made by experienced people in my squad trying to claim heavy assets that if they don't take it, some random blueberry is going to grab it and get it blown up. I have seen veteran players make squads that are joined by all of the regulars on a server, and I regularly see these squads grab varied important vehicles under the same philosophy of we're the most experienced people on the server, so we better grab and take care of these very important things before somebody who doesn't know how to ends up getting them. Now, I can understand this argument, but what I can't get over are two separate things. First of all, I just can't get over how much it decreases the effectiveness of that squad's infantry. Immediately, you're just down 2 men, and then in exchange, you get some extra firepower in some situations. Emphasis on some. Because if that vehicle is playing well, if it's truly a really good vehicle player who needs to have that so that the blueberries don't get it, it is very, very likely that that player will never cross paths with the rest of your infantry squad, assuming they're actually playing it effectively. And the other argument I would make against this is why did you join an infantry squad then? If you want a BTR and you think that if you don't get it, it'll be claimed by somebody less effective, why did you join an infantry squad? That squad already has a plan, a goal, and an idea of what they want to use to achieve it. If this is what you truly believe, make a dedicated APC squad and claim it. Lock it when you reach the appropriate number of people, and then run that vehicle to the best of your ability. This is what I tell people who join my squad and start begging for heavy vehicles. This is simply the way I did it. I was interested in APCs. They're fun, they're big, they're cool. Nice. I wanted to play a lot of them in V9, so I made APC squads. It was a really simple approach. And yet for some reason I never see that cross anyone's mind. They're constantly joining infantry squads and then begging for the asset and making these kind of arguments. Now, some servers do have rules where you can't lock at under 4 players. All I have to say about that is it's not the end of the world if the price to pay for playing with an APC means that you're responsible for one other APC. 4 people is 2 APCs or 2 IFEs. And then, of course, there are also servers that don't have that. If you're in North America, we love Fear and Terror. It's a clan-based server, so you'll get a competent community, and there's no lock rules. So you can make your 2-man APC squads to your heart's desire. Also, you will run into these types of people. Don't think it's a rarity. You will always have people spawning at main with the crewman kit, running up to the striker, and spamming F and begging for it. All I have to say is stick to your guns. If you want the striker, approve it. If you do not want the striker, which, I mean, if I've convinced you of anything you don't, do not approve it. Tell them to respawn, tell them to grab a conventional kit, and tell them to get to the front lines. Kick them if they don't comply. Don't give in once you've made these decisions. And with that, just a quick recap of the reasons why I don't take vehicles. Number 1, the community will rarely run vehicles effectively. Number 2, Even if they do run them effectively, the vehicle will be detrimental in many scenarios you face. Number 3, armored vehicles are often much less likely to be readily available for rapid redeployment than a truck. And number 4, taking an armored vehicle forces either the infantry or the vehicle to play less effectively than they would if they were in their own separate independent squads. Of course, there is a massive thing that I'm not taking into consideration, a bit of an elephant in the room. Vehicles are fun. Now, I will be the first to admit, I am a tryhard, and I try to shape everything towards what's most effective. But just because I've argued against mechanized infantry squads doesn't mean that you can't run mechanized infantry squads for fun. But there is one thing I will say. If you really have an itch to play with an APC or an IFE, there are better options. Just make a dedicated vehicle squad. They always work beautifully. Don't make a less effective infantry squad in order to fulfill a craving. Make a dedicated squad for it and start learning the ropes. I'll be making guides for tank, IFE, and APC squads in the very distant future, most likely, but it's really not that complicated. Project Reality servers have had a long history of creating rules regarding vehicle claims, and it works. Even if you don't want to do this, respect other people's claims if they decide to. Don't snag the Bradley if somebody makes a squad titled IFE. Please remember, respecting other people's claims is important. Even if you think you'll do better, or you have a history with the person who has claimed another vehicle, whether it's by squad name, callout, or marker, just let them have it. This goes beyond just courtesy. The claim is sacred, and without it, we are lost. The rule of dibs. Come on, guys, that's ingrained into our culture. Coordination and communication come first. If the team starts fighting itself for assets, how the fuck are you supposed to fight the enemy? If you spend just a few hours playing Project Reality and you see the coordination and the respect that the players have when it comes to dedicated vehicle squads, you will share my optimism for what squad could be and hate the free-for-all circus that vehicle claiming has become. If I see one more 9-man infantry squad snatching the Bradley when there's a locked 2-man squad called IFE with crewman kits, I'm gonna shoot someone. One other quick note, if you're planning on making your own APC or IFE squads, lock it at the appropriate number of players. Don't forget what I said about 9-man mortar squads in the previous guides, the same theory applies here. Even a locked 4-man APC squad running 2 vehicles with 5 unassigned players on the team is better than a 9-man APC squad with scattered leaderless blueberries across the map. If there are unassigned players, somebody will eventually make a squad and run infantry. Make sure you're not fucking over the team when that happens by having useless blueberry detachments that you can't properly lead. But if I am unable to enlighten you as to the ways of dedicated vehicle squads and you are absolutely dead set on running mechanized infantry, at least let me give you a tip. Do not crew the armored vehicle. If there is any infantry in your squad, you should never have a lead crewman kit. Most people who do this leave a mindless horde of infantry off on their own, making their own decisions, spawning at irrelevant places, and not communicating whatsoever. It basically becomes an overglorified free kit squad. Even if you intend to keep your APC and infantry together and lead them from the APC, you're still putting your guys at a massive disadvantage. You need more men to place rallies, decreasing your ability to act quickly and increasing the likelihood of you getting squad wiped. You also have way too much to focus on while handling your APC effectively to be understanding exactly what the infantry is going through and making decisions on their behalf. If you're damaged and need to RTB, you're leaving your squad unattended for significant portions of time. If the APC and infantry need to split ways, as is often the most strategic decision, then you're leaving them on their own yet again. No matter how convincing of an argument I make here, there's probably going to be somebody in the comments arguing in favor of leading from an APC because it's what they enjoy doing. They'll probably point out some small thing that I've missed that could potentially allow a squad leader leading from an APC to have some marginal advantage in some obscure field, like, ooh, they have better optics. But there's something really important to remember. Nobody who is doing this ever sat down, looked at a 7-man infantry team and a 2-man vehicle crew and thought, where do I need to be as the SL to make this the most effective? And came to the conclusion that they should be in that vehicle. They created a squad, ran to the striker, switched to the gunner seat because it's fun, and it's what they wanted to do, and then they try to mold the rest of their squad into something half effective around it and then get defensive if you question how useful it is. What about smaller and cheaper vehicles? I've only talked about APCs so far. Well, MTLBs are just impractical. There's a reason we call them shit boxes. They just don't have the speed to keep you competitive when it comes to staying highly mobile. MREPs are alright, but you have to consider that in order to fit your full squad, you're gonna need two. At that point, you're worth as many tickets as an APC anyway. If one man stays in the gun of each, you're also down the same number of people as you would be if you just took an APC. And if both are two-manned, you're left with literally only 5 boots on the ground. I guess technically 10? I didn't think that line through. Neither of these are significantly big deterrents, and I've seen squads with two MRAPs being effective, but personally, I don't think they're worth it, and I like to have options back at main in the event of a squad wipe. MRAPs are great vehicles for setting mid-game oh shit rallies, as I like to call them, when everything you have gets overrun. Also, if you take two MRAPs in a logi truck, you're really pushing what's considered to be a reasonable number of vehicles for one squad to be dominating. Don't forget that you're part of the team. One MRAP and one logi truck can actually be a very decent combination, especially off of match start for those midpoint rushes. You're still left with the disadvantage of how conspicuous a combat vehicle can make you, but you're getting some firepower in return. I've seen this combination used quite well with quite a bit of success, especially, as I said, for those midpoint rushes. And I do believe that it has a place in squad, though I've never really been particularly interested in coordinating it. That same oh shit rally philosophy is the reason why I don't take a lot of technicals when playing as irregulars. Often I'll grab a Logi and then maybe a Dishka or an SPG, but if we have full-size trucks, I'll normally stick with those. And of course, if there's a transport techie, I'm all over that shit. It's the best combination of raw speed and troop capacity. What I won't do is take three or more vehicles, with the sole exception of certain invasion layers where I'm trying to get as much of the team assets to the front lines as quickly as possible, because I doubt anyone else will. You don't have to adopt my minimalist approach to vehicles, especially lighter ones. I still stand fairly firmly by my opinion that you shouldn't be taking APCs or anything heavier with your infantry squads, but it's a different story with light vehicles, and a lot of my hesitancy to use them stems from habits picked up in previous versions where they were worth way more tickets. There are also some things that I will dive much deeper into in the advanced guide that shape my views. If you want to experiment with some things, though, and see if you can adopt a playstyle that works well with some light vehicles, go for it. Just remember a few things. Make sure it's not limiting your options and your ability to act as an infantry squad first and foremost, and then make sure you're not using an unreasonable amount of your team's resources. And last of all, tanks. I'll keep this brief and simple. You are either running a tank squad, or you are not claiming the tank. Don't make exceptions to this rule. If there's a situation where the tank is getting left at main unused and nobody has a squad named after armor or tank or anything like that, and you want to go claim it, instead of allowing your people to grab crewmen, spawn at main, and approving it, just tell them to leave the squad and create one named tank. They're doing the same thing anyway. They all have to respawn. They're not about to lose their kits. That'll set a better precedent for the community and start teaching them about the importance of dedicated armor. It'll give those guys access to command chat, and it'll smooth out the claiming system so that people will look and see that there is a tank squad and not try to claim it. The community was actually getting pretty decent about doing dedicated armor squads on a handful of servers that we played on, at least until the tanks were put onto a delayed spawn. Now you'll get to a lot of situations like this where you'll see the tank being run by a full 9-man infantry squad, and it's always just a shit show. Anyway, that just about concludes everything. The next part in this guide will be focusing almost entirely on fob building, so I'll see you guys in the next one.